Well, hello everybody. It's such a delight to be a part of this process. I want to talk to you a bit today about professional responsibility. We live in an era in which we all need to not just be professionals in reference to what we do, but we also need to realize that what we do has tremendous high stakes for individuals with intellectual disability. And what I'm going to do over the next 15 or 20 minutes is summarize a chapter that is in the second edition of a book that Ruth Luckeson and I have just published through AAIDD called Clinical Judgment. Because as you look at the complex issues that clinicians, using that word very broadly, face in today's world, they really are having to make very difficult decisions with and for individuals. So at the heart of that decision-making process is not just respect for the person, but it's also reflecting professional responsibility. And what we do in a particular chapter of the book is to talk about what is professional responsibility, and then how does clinical judgment relate to that. And what I want to do very briefly is to give you the highlights of, first, what is professional responsibility, and secondly, how does clinical judgment relate to that process. This is increasingly important because our U.S. Supreme Court has, in the most recent decision regarding people with AAIDD, the Hall decision, said that the diagnosis of intellectual disability is essentially a clinical decision. And if that is indeed the case, which I think most of us believe is, then the question is, what role does professional responsibility play in that decision-making process? So professional responsibility is really composed of four things. As we indicate in the graph figure that I'm sure that you would not be able to read if I showed it to you, the first thing that professional responsibility involves is best practices. And one of the things that many of us have worked on over the years in terms of the Diagnostic and Treatment Manual is what are the best practices in terms of the field of intellectual disability. And so what we do there is talk a bit about what are the best practices in reference to the definition of intellectual disability. What are the best practices in terms of diagnosing a person who potentially has intellectual disability? What are the best practices in terms of classifying people? What are the best practices in terms of providing supports to individuals? What are the best practices in terms of the etiology, the view that we have as to the cause of the condition? And then finally, what are the best practices regarding looking at the whole person, which we call the multidimensionality of human functioning? So a big part of professional responsibility is to indeed use best practices. Now it's interesting, I just came from a session on the Hall decision, the Supreme Court. A very significant thing happened in that decision, and that is the court said for the very first time that the diagnosis of intellectual disability must be more than an IQ score. That indeed when you look at diagnosing an individual, professionally speaking, you need to look at both the intellectual functioning of the person and the adaptive behavior of the individual. Well, once that has become the case, then the question becomes, what are the best practices in terms of assessment, of diagnosing, of classifying? Do you, for example, when you classify people, really have a purpose for that classification? Or is the classification based upon the old concept of IQ level? Because classification in today's world is used really in very different ways than it was in previous times. We classify people now for reimbursement, for example. We classify people in terms of research purposes. We classify people in terms of the intensity of their support needs. So best practices then, whether or not those practices relate to diagnosing or supports provision or how we explain the condition, the etiology of the condition, really is a key part of what we call professional responsibility. But secondly, professional responsibility also involves professional standards. And every profession has a list or a book or a number of volumes of professional standards. And what we do, and I certainly will only summarize this very quickly, is we look across a number of professions. And what are the common standards that guide professional conduct? And what you find are standards such as using current information and using valid information, using judgment that is indeed consistent with good science, respecting client and professional relationships, and using personal information properly and avoiding any conflict of interest. And those standards, and there are a few others, but those standards are really common across the different professions that deal with people with intellectual disability. So that's a second major component of professional responsibility. It's to use those standards that are germane to your particular discipline, but what you find when you look critically across professions and disciplines is those standards are really quite consistent. But then there's a third part of professional responsibility, and that is professional ethics. Now, professional ethics, again, have a lot of commonalities regardless of what profession you're looking at. And what we do is we really reduce those professional ethics to the following three. And these are powerful. They're really powerful when you think about how they relate to the work that each of us does. The first one is justice. And justice as a professional ethic essentially means that we treat all people equally. And so that many of you watching may know I've done a lot of work in the field of quality of life. And one of the big issues that we had to face as we approached that area and began to think about how do we conceptualize it, how do we measure it, how do we apply it, we had to treat this issue of justice. And that is quality of life the same for all people, or is quality of life dependent upon your functional level? And I remember, probably before some of you were born, having discussions about do we need separate items or separate measures or separate concepts of quality of life for people with severe and profound impairments? Or can we really stand outside of that box and really use this ethical principle to say that quality of life is indeed quality of life, regardless of what your functional level is? And so that is a professional ethic that is really challenging whether or not you are diagnosing people, whether or not you're working with people within the criminal justice system, whether or not you're working with special ed kids. The question is, are you treating all people equally, or are you separating them and segregating them and calling it, special schools or whatever term you want to use? But there's a second very powerful ethical principle, and that is beneficence. And beneficence means doing good. And when you think about doing an ISP, for example, is that ISP really a support plan, or is it a legal document that basically lists the deficits of the person? It's interesting, we've done a number of studies internationally where we've looked at the content of individual support plans. And we ask three very simple questions, or four very simple questions of people who develop and use ISPs. Question number one, how long is your ISP? Well, on the average across 14 countries, it's 40 pages. Question number two, what's the most common thing you do with your ISP? The most common answer we get is we file it. Question number three, how many people read it? The mode is 2. And the fourth question is, how many people understand it? The mode is 0. So consequently, the question becomes, is an ISP doing good for the person, or is it really something that is written and gets filed and never used? The interesting study that I hope some of you will think about doing is interview a random group of service recipients and ask them a very basic question. Give me or tell me the 3 most important things that have happened to you during the last year. And they'll tell you. Then go back into their ISPs and see whether or not those 3 things were ever mentioned in their ISP. And what you're going to find, because we've done this empirically, is there's no relationship whatsoever. Because what we find when we analyze ISPs is that the vast majority of an ISP is simply a legal document that lists out certain responsibilities and duties, etc., and it provides a list of deficits of the individual and recommendations for the person, but really nothing about supports and supports provision. So the net result is that ethical principle of beneficence is so important from a professional judgment or a human rights or any other perspective you want to take. And finally, the third perspective, the third ethical principle is the idea of autonomy. And that simply is to reflect the authority of every person to have control over their life as much as possible. It's interesting that this conference, and we're here at the 138th conference, began with supporting not just decision-making, but self-determination. And that's really the ethical principle of autonomy. So the net result is professional judgment has these three components I've just mentioned. It has a lot to do with best practices. It has a lot to do with professional standards and following those standards, but it has a great deal to do with ethics and professional ethics. So the question then becomes, where does clinical judgment fall into this role? Well, clinical judgment, and I'll define it here for you very briefly, really plays a variable role in professional responsibility. The more complex the case is, the more clinical judgment is required. And we give you various strategies to use in clinical judgment. But the key thing to remember is that clinical judgment is something that you use to augment professional responsibility. It's not something that replaces it. So you might be asking the question, what is clinical judgment? And rather than relying upon memory, let me give you our very brief, I hope succinct and clearly understandable definition. First, it's defined as a special type of judgment. It's not intuition. It's easier. It's a very special type of judgment built upon respect for the person. In fact, the first chapter of the second edition of the book talks about clinical judgment begins with respect for the person. And what does respect for the person really mean? Well, it means that you listen to the person. It means that if you do person-centered planning, the person is there. It's very fascinating. I've had the experience of working with a lot of organizations throughout the world. It's fascinating to walk into an organization and say, well, what's your approach to ISP development? Invariably, they'll say person-centered planning. I say, well, what role does the person play in that? And then they start stuttering. Well, and you get all the litany of answers as to why individuals are not included in their ISP meetings. And then we wonder why clients aren't excited about their ISPs. It's amazing. So anyway, but it's built upon respect for the person. If you truly respect the individual in terms of ISPs, the person will have a one-page summary of their ISP. And furthermore, they will be involved in its development, implementation, and monitoring. I mean, if you really respect the person should be the focus of what you do. Secondly, in terms of second sentence, clinical judgment emerges from the clinician's specialized training and experience, as well as specific knowledge of the individual and the person's environment. And that's so important in today's world because people go across environments now. In years past, it was a single environment. Today, it's not a single environment. It's a multiple environment. And so consequently, you have to become familiar with what we refer to as systems thinking and really look at the role that the microsystem plays, the individual. And do you indeed build support plans on the strengths of the individual as opposed to the weaknesses of the person? But there's also the mesosystem. When we look at what predicts quality of life, for example, it's the mesosystem level variables that are most predictive. Those are organization-related factors. And then you have the macro system, the larger cultural factors. So clinical judgment then is a special kind of knowledge that's built upon respect for the person, that incorporates best practices, based on your experience and your training. And then finally, to conclude, let me share with you what we call an application model. And I'm not here to sell the book, by the way, but it might be worth nighttime reading, and I'm certain it's great for insomnia. Absolutely. But in any event, we do have a very simple clinical judgment application model. And we build that model around the three major functions of clinicians. And those three functions are to diagnose, to classify, and to plan supports. And then within each of those three major functions, we have 4 clinical judgment strategies that are going to lead to high quality, valid, and precise decisions or recommendations. Because that's what clinical judgment should do for you, is to lead to more valid, precise, and indeed quality decisions. So here are the 4 strategies, and if you want more detail, quote, read the book. I'm sure you've heard that somewhere along the way, right? The audience here laughed at that, so I think you've all been there and done that, right? The first thing you do as a strategy is you clarify the question. You know, a lot of people try to answer questions without knowing what the question is. And what we mean by that is the question related to a diagnosis? Or is the question related to a classification? Or is the question related to developing a support system for a person? So you need to understand clearly what question are you being asked to provide a good answer. Secondly, you assemble a thorough history. Now that thorough history is part social, it's part educational, it's part medical. But you cannot make good decisions without good information. The third strategy is you conduct broad-based assessments. Now, broad-based assessments mean that you look at intellectual, you look at adaptive behavior, you look at functional assessments, you look at situational assessments to really form the best recommendation or decision that you can. And finally, you use a type of thinking which is difficult but is absolutely essential. And that is you then synthesize all that information. You pull it together, you integrate it. Because it's only when you synthesize good information that you come up with a good decision and a good recommendation. So, in conclusion, when you think about professional responsibility, and we're all professionals, regardless of what role you play in an organization, professionalism is not a degree-related phenomenon. It's a competency-related phenomenon. And so when you think about professional responsibility, whether or not you're a direct service provider, whether or not you're a direct support staff, whether or not you're a client in services, whether or not you're a clinician in the usual traditional sense, then remember that professional responsibility is something that is the hallmark of anyone's daily life. And to do good, or to demonstrate good professional responsibility, you need to use best practices. You need to indeed use professional standards and be guided by those standards. You need to incorporate professional ethics into your daily decision making. And then you use clinical judgment, as I've defined and outlined, to help you make better and more valid and precise decisions and or recommendations. So again, it's been my pleasure. I hope that you've learned a couple things along the way, and obviously I wish you the very best. Thank you.